Women's Zen Saturday lecture series. Our speaker this morning is the Reverend Doju Layton, and his talk is going to be the human and non-human Sanghas, Bodhisattva vows in the age of climate crisis. Okay, Joe, would you like to have the opening sutra, please?
Sorry. An unsurpassed, penetrating, and perfect Dharma is rarely met with, even in 100,000 million kalpas. Having it to see and listen to, remember and accept. I vow to taste the truth of the Tathagata's teaching.
And now a brief statement on dana.
Yes, good morning. In Buddhism, when practitioners share their understanding of the teachings and practice, it is offered freely as a practice of dana paramita. Dana is a Pali word that means generosity or to give freely, and this practice is done without expectation of getting something in return. This is the spirit of speaking about the Dharma. Other ways to practice dana are to offer support to those who share the teachings, to support places of spiritual practice, and to give without judgment or expectation when opportunities arise. Those who share the teachings at Great Tree do so on a dana basis. Please support their practice by giving what you can. And my understanding is that Reverend Doju has asked that dana go to Great Tree, so I will put those links into the chat. Thank you.
Our speaker, Reverend Doju Layton, grew up near Washington, D.C. and began exploring Buddhism while in high school. His practice started in earnest when he later entered a PhD program in evolutionary biology. During this time, he began practicing zazen at the Missouri Zen Center in St. Louis, inspired after reading Kosho Uchiyama's Opening the Hand of Thought. In 2015, he decided to move to Sanshinji in Bloomington to practice under Shohaku Okumura Roshi. Doju was ordained as a novice priest in 2017. To supplement his priest training, Doju studied Buddhism at Indiana University, receiving a master's degree in religious studies in 2021. He is interested in the intersection of practice, ecology, and politics, and how to engage with these topics without distorting the Buddhist tradition. Welcome, Reverend Doju.
Thank you all for having me. Can you hear me okay? All right, excellent. So I'd like to start with a little anecdote. I have a fellow Sangha member here at Sanshinji. His name's Sawyer Hitchcock. And he was telling me one day, as you heard, I'm interested in biology and I used to study it. So he was telling me that he had a sort of ancestor who was a well-known geologist. Someone Hitchcock is his last name. And it just so happened that later that day, I was spending some time with my father, and he was showing me this genealogy software that he was really into. And I had this person's name in my head that my friend had mentioned, and this thing had this function where you could sort of type in anyone's name and it would tell you if you're related to them and how. So it turned out that I was related to this Hitchcock person also, which meant that I was related to this Sangha member. And it turned out that we were 10th cousins, which means that we shared a great times 9 grandfather. And this person's name was Luke Hitchcock, who was a guy who came to Connecticut from England in 1614. And so, I thought this was pretty remarkable. Wow, I got this cousin in the Sangha. Who knew? And I looked into it a little bit further. And first, it turns out that every person has 2,048 great times 9 grandparents. So there are quite a few opportunities for you to share relatives. And actually what that works out to is that you have 20 million 10th cousins. So actually not very remarkable at all that I happen to be related to this person. So, I dug a little deeper with this, and it turns out that, in my case, as someone with European ancestry, if you go back only 1,000 years, you're related to literally every other person with European ancestry. And this is sort of because, if you picture way back when people were mostly living in small villages, there was a lot of sort of cousin marriage and stuff, either first cousins or more distant. And so everyone in a village was related. And so basically, as soon as one person left from one village to another, everyone in those two villages was related. So it just takes one kind of person leaving a community for everyone in those communities to become technically related to one another. And what's even more remarkable, you only have to go back about 2,000 years before every single human, it's thought, shares common ancestry, which is pretty remarkable. And, again, with my biology background, I thought I'd sort of take this a step further, and one of the things that I studied was evolutionary relationships. I studied plants. But, as many of you probably know, our closest non-human relative is the chimpanzee. So if you go back, you have to take some bigger leaps now, but 6 million years, we share a common ancestor with chimpanzees. If you go back further than that, 25 million years, all monkeys and apes, including ourselves, are related. Go back farther than that to 350 million years ago, and then we have a common ancestor with fish. 550 million years ago, we have a common ancestor with sea urchins and sea cucumbers. If you go back 650 million years, we're sharing an ancestor with insects and worms. Finally, if you go back 1.5 billion years, plants we share a common ancestor with. 2 billion years, common ancestor with bacteria. And then finally, life itself started 3.5 billion years ago from inanimate stuff, which was floating around in space only 4.5 billion years ago before it formed into the Earth. The sun didn't form until 4.6 billion years ago, and then, there's quite a bit of a gap between that and the formation of the universe, which is thought to be 13.7 billion years ago, when all of the stuff was in one spot, the ultimate common ancestor for all beings, living and non-being. So pretty remarkable, And what the takeaway here sort of is that everything in the universe, whether animate or inanimate, is quite literally our family. Any cutoff we make to a separate family lineage is ultimately just arbitrary. We're choosing some cutoff point at which we're saying, oh, those things and people aren't related to me anymore. So I use this as a segue to talk about what the meaning of Sangha is. And like many Buddhist terms, Sangha is one that's gone through an evolution over the course of Buddhist history. Just talking about the word itself, this is sort of interesting. So as many of you probably know, Sanskrit is related to English. They're both Indo-European languages, so they share a common ancestor as well. And the prefix, so Sangha, the sum part, the first part, is a prefix that's related to the Greek prefix sin, or sim, which we use a lot. So words like sympathy or symbiosis or synthesis, these are related to the word Sangha through that prefix. And it means together or with or one in both cases. And the second part of the word, it comes from the root han, so like samhan was like, I guess, the etymological roots, but that han meant to come into contact with or to strike. So it literally means something like struck well together, or maybe poetically interpreted, coming into contact as one. And this word was used prior to Buddhism, of course, and it had sort of a meaning like a guild or an association of people working together in the same trade. But it was also sometimes used more loosely to mean something like a community or an assembly. When it was adopted by Buddhists, it originally referred only to nuns and monks, not to lay people or any other beings, really. It was just this community of ordained people. But as many things in Mahayana Buddhism, the meaning, got more and more expansive over time. So in Mahayana Buddhism, you start to see lay people included. So sometimes you'll hear the fourfold assembly, which refers to nuns and monks, lay women and lay men. That's the sort of broader Mahayana Sangha. And then later still, you get sort of further elaborations. So you get Dogen, for example, using the term ocean assembly, referring to everything in the vast ocean included as part of the Sangha. The word Sangha got transliterated into Chinese and Sino-Japanese as Sogya. So this is just supposed to sound like Sangha, so Sogya. It's not a literal translation. Sometimes they did use a literal translation, which was Wagoshu, which means harmonious many, which I quite like. And interestingly, in Chinese, so this first character of Sogya, the soul, became the word to refer to a monk or a nun. So even though this was originally just a transliterated syllable, it took on the meaning of nun or monk in later Chinese usage. It also can mean Sangha, though, still. And so you have to be a little bit careful if you're looking at old texts as to which it means. And sometimes this can lead to translation issues where, it's ambiguous whether or not a text is talking about an individual monk or nun or a group of monks and nuns or the Sangha more broadly, which is an interesting ambiguity, I think. Okay, so I mentioned the ocean assembly of Dogen. So it's not just Soto Zen Buddhists that like this idea of a Sangha that includes everything. Thich Nhat Hanh talks about it, for example. So he has a passage where he says, in the Buddhist scriptures, it is said that there are 4 communities, monks, nuns, laymen, and laywomen, as I mentioned. But I also include elements that are not human in the Sangha. The trees, water, air, birds, and so on can all be members of our Sangha. A beautiful walking path may be part of our Sangha. A good cushion can be also. We can make many things into supportive elements of our Sangha. This idea is not entirely new. It can be found throughout the sutras and in the Abhidharma too. The Abhidharma is like sort of the, as you probably know, kind of the philosophical distillation of stuff in the sutras. A pebble, a leaf, and a dahlia are mentioned in the Saddharma Pundarika Sutra in this respect. That's the formal name for the Lotus Sutra. It is said in the Pure Land Sutra that if you are mindful, then when the wind blows through the trees, you will hear the Dharma. The whole cosmos is preaching the Buddha Dharma and practicing the Buddha Dharma. If you are attentive, you will get in touch with that Sangha. So this is quite an explicit nod to, the Sangha is including all beings, whether or not they're sentient. And Dogen is a major proponent of this idea. One of the chapters of the Shobo Genzo that my teacher, Okumura Roshi, recently did a Genzo on is called The Insentient Preach the Dharma. If you haven't looked at it, it's a really great fascicle of the Shobo Genzo. As usual, though, they can be pretty confusing. So just in case you aren't familiar with this idea, I thought I'd read a little bit from there, and I have to pull this up on my computer screen, so give me just a sec to move things around on my desktop.
What is the Japanese name?
Mujo Seppo.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the fascicle is based on a dialogue between the national teacher, who is a historic monk from the Tang Dynasty, who Dogen really admires, and one of his students. So the student is asking him. I'm going to pick up in the middle of the dialogue here, but he says, if insentient beings are endowed with mind, which the national teacher argues earlier, but I won't get into that, are they also able to expound the Dharma or not? So are insentient beings able to expound the Dharma or not? The master said, they always expound it brilliantly without let up. The monk asked, why can't I hear it? The master replied, it is only you yourself who do not hear it. Don't disturb other people who are hearing. The monk said, "Who are the people who can hear?" The master said, "All sages can hear it." The monk said, "If so, do living beings lack the ability?" The master said, "I expound for the sake of living beings. I do not expound for sages." So there's some kind of wordplay going on here, because he's talking about both his own expounding of the Dharma in like the sense of him giving a Dharma talk or something. So in that sense, he's expounding for the sake of living beings, and he doesn't need to preach to the already awakened reality. So expound for sages. But on the other hand, what they're talking about here is insentient beings as reality itself. So our reality is mostly made up of insentient beings. As I look in the Zendo, there are no other sentient beings that I see. It's all just inanimate stuff. But it is part of true reality. And insofar as it's part of true reality, it is preaching the Dharma. It is telling me the truth of reality itself. So the monk continues, "I am foolish and deaf. I don't hear the Dharma expounding of insentient beings. Master, you are the teacher of human and heavenly beings, and you explain Prajnaparamita. Are you able to hear it or not?" The master said, "I don't hear it either," which is kind of a funny twist, right? You'd expect him to be able to hear it. The monk said, "Why don't you hear it?" And the master said, "Fortunately, I don't hear it. If I heard the Dharma expounding of the insentient beings, I would be equal to all the sages. So how could you see me and hear me expounding the Dharma?" So the idea here is getting at this kind of binary that we're always finding in Dogen's teaching. So on the one hand, we have samsara, and on the other, we have nirvana. And as Dogen is always stressing, these are ultimately the same thing. As my teacher likes to say, it's like referring to this as 5 fingers versus 1 hand. It's the same thing there, but we're just thinking about it and approaching it in a different way. So likewise here, when the national teacher is using this term insentient, what he's really sort of getting at is this nirvanic view of oneness that is sort of ineffable and beyond our sort of picking and choosing. Whereas sentience, as we all know from our crazy minds, are all about dividing things up. So that's sort of the contrast he's drawing here. So insofar as he's teaching and using words, he can't hear the insentient preaching the Dharma because it requires using words and concepts. But when we sit back in zazen, we let that insentience, so to speak, into our reality. So Dogen has all kinds of fun playing with these words if you look at the fascicle, but that's kind of fundamentally what's going on in this chapter. So, and I should say too, if I tend to sort of rattle on, but if anyone has any questions or anything, please feel free to just unmute yourself and speak up. I don't mind being interrupted. Sometimes this stuff can get strange and confusing. Okay, so moving on. There's another text that refers to Sangha of Dogen. So at Sanshinji here, we do a regular Ryaku Fusatsu, so once a month we renew our vows. And when we do that, we recite a text that Dogen wrote called the Kyoju Kaimon, which is sort of his commentary basically on the precepts. And when he talks about taking refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, he refers to them in 3 different ways. So, we have the normal formulation, I take refuge in Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. But what Dogen says is there are 3 ways of understanding this. One is the absolute way, one is the maintaining way, and one is the manifesting way. And I won't get into all of it, but for our purposes, the absolute sense is what's of interest here. And this word absolute, the original writing uses the phrase one body. So it's in the sense of everything is included in these precepts, in this vow. So when he's talking about the absolute 3 treasures, he says, the virtue of peace and harmony is the Sangha treasure. So the virtue of peace and harmony is the Sangha treasure. And my teacher wrote a little commentary on this part, and he said, each and everything within this one seamless reality is the Sangha treasure. All beings are the Sangha treasure as a single body, or absolute three treasures. They are within peace and harmony. So as absolute or one body, three treasures, this seamless reality as one body includes all time and space, and is Buddha, and is Dharma, and is Sangha. There is no separation. So this is the expansive view of Sangha that includes everything. In the other interpretation, so the manifesting and maintaining, the manifesting is the Sangha that exists with the historical Buddha, so the actual group of people that practiced with him, and then the maintaining is the continuation of the Sangha down to us today. So there are different ways to look at this word. So I started the talk, discussing our broadest version of family, which, as I said, includes non-humans and non-living things too, if we go all the way back to the beginning. However, as humans, we have difficulty of thinking of family beyond our immediate one, if we even bother to do that. A lot of us don't even spend much time with our families. And I think it's this kind of tendency that has led to a lot of the problems that we are experiencing today, that our sort of broader Sangha, so to speak, is experiencing. The title mentions climate crisis, but I think we all are familiar with these problems. We don't need to get into the specific gloom and doom aspects of the things that we face as a society. And besides, I think solutions are more interesting. So how can we as Buddhists do something positive in this regard? And I think that this solution really has to be found within the concept of Sangha itself. And there's a passage that I'd like to share with you from Living by Vow. This is one of my teacher's books. And it discusses what Sangha means in this context. So he writes, Sangha, or community, is an important manifestation of the concept of vow. We see this in the life of Guishan Lingyo, a famous Chinese Zen master who established a large and influential Sangha in China. How he accomplished this is instructive. So Guishan was instrumental in the establishment of Zen monasteries. It goes on. He was the tenzo, the chief cook in the monastery where he practiced with his teacher, Baizhang Huihai. So this is the person who's supposed to have written the first monastic code. So often people will refer to the Baizhang pure precept. So one day, Guishan was standing near the abbot's room where Baizhang was staying. So Baizhang's the abbot, Guishan's the tenzo. So Baizhang asked Guishan, "Who is it?" And Guishan replied, "It's me, Lingyo," which is his Dharma name. Baizhang said, "Would you dig in the fire pot and see if there is fire or not?" It was winter, and the fire pot was their source of heat. So Guishan stirred the fire pot and said, "No fire." Then Baizhang got up and came over, dug deep into the ashes, and found a tiny little ember. He showed it to Lingyo and said, "What is this? Isn't this fire?" Guishan was enlightened, as these stories often end, right? So the fire in this story is referring to the Buddha nature. And Buddha nature is not something solid or immovable, but rather an energy that motivates us to practice. And not just zazen or Buddhist practice. Buddha nature is the fire of the life force that enables us to aspire to be better persons, to be more helpful to others, and to settle into a healthy way of life, and to practice the way. It's difficult to find the fire of Buddha nature inside ourselves, but we must. It's there. We are alive, so we have this force that drives us to practice and wake up to the reality of life. It may be only an ember, but all of us, without exception, have it. If we try to build a fire in a hibachi or fire pot with a single piece of charcoal, it soon dies out. And this is the crucial part here. But even one tiny ember, if fed with charcoal, becomes a big fire. This is the meaning of Sangha. We practice together with other people in a Sangha. Each of us has a small fire, which alone will die out sooner or later, but together we become bigger than ourselves. This was Guishan Lingyo's enlightenment. So I think that there are a lot of currents in our society that kind of fight against this tendency for community, for Sangha. And I think that it's our job as Buddhists to really counteract this and make solid communities, make solid Sanghas, especially with the values that we have as Buddhists with our vows. So what does this mean? Later in the book, Okumura Roshi continues, to have a community instead of a collection of individuals. To have harmony, we need something that unifies. To make soup, we chop the ingredients and put them in a pot. Then add seasoning and cook it until the individual flavors blend to make one taste. Similarly, we need to cook ourselves and make these individuals into one community with one taste, the taste of Dharma. Harmony unifies a collection of individuals into a community in which we can take refuge. And so I think when we look at our vows, we often see them as something, that we have to do ourselves as individuals. We're trying to save all beings, as an individual. We're trying to, do everything that is good as an individual. But really, the taking refuge in Sangha part has to be viewed together, I think, with these vows. We can't really do much as little individuals, but we can do a lot when we combine our chopped up ingredients together and work together as a team to do something. And I think that this is the fundamental challenge that we face in the future. How are we going to get together as a society and make a big change? Because, my little individual actions, if I choose not to take any flights, or, if I live a really low carbon lifestyle or whatever, it's not going to change anything if it's just, this group of people here. But together we can motivate other people to see why we want to do this. And that's how change happens over time. So to go further with that, the title of the talk also mentioned the Bodhisattva vows, right? So perhaps some of you are thinking, we take a Bodhisattva vow that says, beings are numberless, I vow to save them or free them, depending on the translation. So isn't that relevant to solving these environmental issues that we face? And certainly it is, but I think we have to inspect what this phrase really means, because there are actually some translation issues with it. So the original Chinese or Japanese version of this phrase is Shujo Muhen Seigando. And the term, so we say beings are numberless, I vow to save them. But this shujo, that's the word that's supposed to mean beings, but it actually means sentient beings. So in this case, it's sort of explicitly not referring to trees and the climate, and other things that aren't kind of human or sentient. And the really interesting part, though, I think, is the word that we translate as save or free. So in the original language, this is do, which actually means to ferry, as in to like ferry across a river. It doesn't mean to save or free. I mean, that's used by extension, but we can get into trouble if we think of it that way. So what this refers to is, there are a lot of river metaphors that the historical Buddha used. So he would say, we're on the shore of samsara and we need to take a raft across the river and get to the shore of nirvana. And so that's the ferrying that is being referred to. As bodhisattvas, we help beings cross this river. But, what's interesting here is that as followers of Dogen, there's actually no river, right? Samsara and nirvana are understood to be one and the same, again, like the 5 fingers versus the 1 hand. So we're already on both shores. We have 1 foot on both shores all the time. So if we look at the deeper meaning here, sanghas, just like societies, operate on some sort of consensus, right? They agree on a generally shared set of values, which then sets the norm of behavior. So, in a sangha, we have slightly different expectations than if you're just going to the grocery store or something, because our little society is a little bit different. But currently, our broader society's core set of values, encourages behavior that's responsible for most of the problems that we face today. generally speaking, we're sort of encouraged to ferry as much wealth and stuff to ourselves and kind of ignore everyone else. And the Sanghas consensus, though, is different, at least in theory, and I think we really need to work to make it a reality. As we know, the Buddha pointed out, early on and frequently, that self-indulgence is one of the primary sources of suffering. And our vow is to help our fellow beings see and treat the world as nirvana rather than samsara. And we, of course, do this through zazen. In our zazen, both samsara and nirvana are there. And when we get up off the cushion, hopefully we can take this experience that we have and work to make reality more like nirvana. That's how I understand our zazen practice. And if we can convince others to take that perspective, and they see that all beings, sentient or not, include our one interconnected family, then other beings are no longer just objects that we're enriching ourselves with, but rather parts of ourselves to be cherished in the way that we normally cherish ourselves, which is to self-indulge. In that way, we have worked to save non-sentient beings from greedy destruction. So even though the vow doesn't refer to like literally saving trees, I think, if we do treat our Sangha in this way, if we work to help sentient beings see reality as nirvana, then that has essentially the side effect of saving these non-sentient beings. There's another reading that could also work here of this phrase, beings are numberless, I vow to save them. So I mentioned that shujo is the word that translates beings, and it really means sort of sentient being normally. But if you take it extremely literally, it just means all life, or like many life is like the literal reading. And life is a bit more ambiguous than sentience. And of course, nowadays we'd include plants in the category of life. Buddhism didn't historically include trees and plants as sentient, but nowadays there's a lot of research that suggests they're more sentient than we used to think. But at any rate, and very broadly, we can understand life as the earth as a whole. It's a living, dynamic system, and this issue with climate is very dynamic and lifelike. And as I said, Dogen said that the insentient preach the Dharma. So it would seem they don't need to be, ferried from samsara to nirvana, right? They're the ones, teaching us about nirvana, not the other way around. And, the national teacher mentioned this as well. And Dogen would also say there's, like I said, no river between samsara and nirvana. We're already dwelling in nirvana, and our practice is about actualizing this, right? So another way of understanding this vow is as our vow of actualizing nirvana through our practice. So when we take the, as Dogen says, the backward step that turns the light inward through zazen, we add this quiet and calm nirvanic perspective to our normal samsaric one. So samsara doesn't go away, and this is really important to remember. I mean, I think that, in early Buddhism, right, the idea is, there's samsara and samsara is bad, and through practicing for a really long time, we get rid of samsara and, go over here to nirvana, right? The river metaphor expresses that quite clearly. But in Mahayana Buddhism, that's not the way that we understand things, right? Again, the five fingers, one hand, they're both right here. So what we're doing in zazen is not getting rid of samsara, and our thoughts are still there, our samsaric thoughts are still there, arising, but we're not grasping onto them. That's the difference. So in that way, both of those perspectives are there at the same time. So in this way, all the boundless life on earth becomes nirvana in our practice, and the vow is fulfilled in that moment. Beings are numberless, I vow to save them. It happens in our zazen because that nirvanic perspective is there already. And the challenge, though, is, doing the hard work of putting this perspective into practice in our normal samsaric lives off the cushion, which is really challenging, right? Because zazen is completely ineffable. There's no content there, the nirvanic part. There's no instructions that, it's really explicitly giving you. But at the same time, we understand this interconnection through it, and we have to act on that basis of understanding ourselves as deeply interconnected with everything. Okay, so to sort of wrap up here, again, the 3 vows that we take are to take refuge in Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. But I often find that, it's so sort of simple sounding and so basic that it's easy to sort of not even think about what this means. You're like, oh yeah, Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, of course, But, so it's on its most basic level, obviously. This means that, the Buddha and his teaching, the Dharma, help us in our lives, and the community of Buddhists help us to facilitate this. So in that way, we want to take refuge in these 3 things, and that's all true. But the Buddha's Dharma body is reality itself, right? So we use this term Dharma body to refer to all reality, because all reality is expressing the Buddha's teaching. So the Sangha are all of the individuals, right, that make up that reality, whether human or non-human. And, as we referred to before, these are Dogen's 3 treasures of one body. And in zazen, where emptiness and interconnectedness meet, the Sangha is our body. That's the important thing to remember, right? The Sangha is our body, and we have to treat it like that, not just this little skin bag, as we say in the tradition. And this is what my teacher's phrase, 1 = 0 = infinity means. I don't know if you all have heard this before, but he says it all the time, so we're very used to it, but maybe I should explain it. So in this kind of formulation, 1 is the self, we're one individual here. 0 is emptiness. So in this perspective, right, when we see the world as emptiness and characterized by impermanence, everything is flowing and there's no solidity and no permanence. So that's 0. And then infinity is when we take the other view and view everything as interconnected. So my teacher likes to talk about Indra's net, right? So this is the idea that there's this infinite net, and at each knot on the net, there's a jewel that reflects all of the other jewels and knots on the net. So we're like, an individual jewel, but we also reflect the entirety of interconnection. So that's what he means when he says 1 = 0 = infinity. So that also includes that samsara and nirvana are 1. So the challenge, again, is putting this teaching zazen gives us into practice and taking the steps to really treat all beings like our own body. But that's what we have to do as Buddhists, I think. So I will leave it there, and any discussion or questions or thoughts that you all have would be very welcomed, and thank you again for having me.
It's a very interesting talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm curious what you or your Sangha, like what interesting solutions you may be currently engaged in.
Yeah, that's a good question, because we actually happen to be in the midst of kind of a major discussion about this. We recently have tried to have our board adopt sort of an environmental policy. So here at Sanshinji, we have a building, that was built sort of in part to be a practice place, but also to be a home for my teacher and his family. And my teacher will be retiring mostly next summer. And so they may be moving out soon into their own place, hopefully in the neighborhood. And we'll have to renovate the building so that it's more suitable to kind of residential practice and stuff, rather than like a family home, at least the part of it that serves that function. So the building that we're in happens to be, it was kind of very cheaply built, and it's not very environmentally friendly. It's poorly insulated. It uses a lot of gas for heat. We have a big energy bill. So, it came up like, well, how are we going to make sure that we do this right, that we don't kind of make another blunder with it. So we've been talking about enacting an environmental policy, and currently the discussions are sort of how broad it should be and how specific. I think it should be, specific and binding. Other people, I think, disagree, but I think we have to work in that direction. Another thing that we've talked about as a result is transportation. So, at Sanshinji here, because Okumura Roshi is well known, we often get people flying in from all over the place. So there have been discussions about kind of discouraging people from making really long trips here just to come for like a 3-day event when we could do it online. And sort of the pandemic, one of the strange, fortunate side effects is, now we have Zoom and we can transmit stuff this way rather than traveling all the time. And then another aspect is sort of the grounds here. So, there's been discussions about, little things like our lawn, like we burn a lot of gas mowing our lawn and a lot of it doesn't get used. So there've been some of it actually, we already turned it into sort of like a grassland area so that we don't need to mow it, one, and two, obviously a lot of non-human beings can use it. But also, we've been talking about expanding that, like maybe we should really do that with all of the land that we're not using actively. So those are a few examples. They're all small things, but we have to start somewhere. And I think any way that we can make tangible changes as a group, I think has potential to spread. And, speaking of that, Zenki from Chapel Hill actually, heard that we were having this discussion, and she contacted me and said, hey, like, tell me about what you're doing. Oh, like, we should do that. So I think that's how these things happen, right? As communities, they spread and grow, and over time, our broader sort of societal perspectives change. So I think we need to be at the vanguard of that.
Thank you. I have one more question, but I can wait until.
Why don't you go ahead, Autumn?
Okay. So I'm also curious, like, on the level of politics and just like how it looks like some of our change has to come from there, and it is obviously a very entrenched and difficult place, and I'm just kind of curious your thoughts or experience. Yeah, I really like the readings and like with liberation theology and Catholicism, where they talk about collective sin versus personal sin or responsibility. So I think it's an interesting question for spiritual communities, because I feel like politics feels like a really dirty thing to touch. And like, I don't know, for my own involvement, people will be like, you're very political. And it's like, I didn't see myself that way, and I don't like to see myself that way. And I just brought myself to volunteer for the Democratic Party for really the first time this year, because I find party politics so off-putting, but it's like a really blunt and imperfect tool that we have. So, and I'm not meaning like Republican, Democrat, but I'm just curious, like, what you've seen or thought about in terms of Sanghas entering into more political and larger scale arenas. It feels like Plum Village, I've seen some of the younger monastics stepping, like, that they were actually attending climate change demonstrations. That was a long, winding question, but
No, and I think it's a really important question. And, this is something that I've been exploring a lot recently because, as was mentioned, I grew up in Washington, D.C., so, I'm sort of like deeply trenched in politics, and I've always been interested in politics. And it's really challenging as a Buddhist, because there's, I think in the early Buddha Sangha, there was kind of almost sort of like an Amish-like tendency to avoid politics, at least in theory. And I think, back at that time, it might have been easier to do that in some ways because they, of course, didn't have democracy, right? Like, they were ruled by kings. They didn't really have much input anyways. If you tried to go out and protest, you just wind up with your head on a spike or something. It's very different from now. So, I think that our job as the Sangha and, modern democracies is to try to understand what our role is, and we can't really look to the Buddha exactly for a vision of what that means, because his political situation was so much different. And the same with Dogen, of course. It's really only recently that this current climate has developed, and so I think we have to resist the temptation to just say, oh, we're, as Buddhists, we have to just stay out of it. There's of course, in the United States, we have this idea of separation of church and state, right? But it's kind of an artificial idea. Since I studied religion, it's really hard to separate normal life from religion if you're a religious person. There are certain explicit things that we can't do, like what the Constitution actually says, right? Is the government shall make no law concerning the establishment of religion or the free exercise thereof. So it doesn't actually say anything about the separation of church and state. I think that without being too I think the real hang up, right, is getting involved in these sort of very angry disputes. And as Buddhists, of course, one of our vows is to not give rise to anger. So this is the really, I think, the crux of the problem, is how do we engage without just, slinging mud at the other side that we don't like? How do we do it in a way that's thoughtful and leaves the door open for people who, may not initially agree with us to come in? Obviously, if we're just antagonizing the other side exclusively, it can lead to violence, or just not convincing really the other people, just more deeply entrenching their ideas. There's an essay that I really like. I'm forgetting the name of the woman. She was a Tibetan practitioner, but it's called "The Wisdom in the Anger." If you're interested in this, I'd recommend looking that up, "The Wisdom in the Anger." And it's all just sort of about how to engage with politics without just succumbing to being angry, to do it in sort of a way that you do without this kind of deep attachment that obviously our tradition is telling us we can't give into. So, of course, there's no easy answer to that question, but I think my basic answer is we have to engage politically, because really, everything is political. Anything that becomes contentious becomes political, so it can't be avoided. But we also have to do it in a way that is true to our other vows as Buddhists. So not giving rise to anger, not killing, not and so forth. So not speaking of the faults of others, insofar as we can do that. So I think we just have to be really careful.
It seems to me that I grew up in a political family, and I spent a lot of time in the political world in Minnesota, whatever that. But it seems to me that some of the things that come up within a sangha that's trying to work together, are the same. It's kind of what you just alluded to. That when I was on the board at the Missouri Zen Center, it was just everybody was doing their political thing, and the more skilled you were at it, the more the chance that you were going to be the one that was going to win out, And I don't even know if we realize how much we do this. And I was thinking as you were speaking, and as Autumn was bringing up her question, that the Sangha could probably be a good practicing place for getting out into the bigger political world, because if we see what we're doing, if we can learn what we're doing that is not working, like you say, if you come on too strong, they're just going to hunker down in their position, and it seems like making the effort to live in community in some way, in Sangha in some way, is a way of actually recognizing what we shouldn't do and what we need to do. And then when it comes time to the moment comes that we can actually do something, we're ready.
Yeah, exactly. I totally agree. And I think, you know, you're right. The Sangha is just sort of a microcosm of regular society with, you know, our specific vows added to it, hopefully. And, you know, I think it is that, and for me, I will say that when I first started practicing, you know, I didn't grow up religious, and, you know, I was always kind of introverted, and you know, the group of friends that I had, you know, I sort of wanted them all to agree with me 100%. And when I sort of made this jump to join a sangha, you know, suddenly I had, you know, I mean, of course we're unified by our interest in practice, but we come from all different kinds of backgrounds and have different ideas about things. And it was sort of, in a way, my first encounter with people who I didn't find it, you know, 100% pleasant to be around all the time, you know. And we have this expression in Japanese monasticism that, you know, when you enter a monastic community, it's like, I think they say putting a bunch of potatoes in like a drum, which I guess is what they used to use to get the dirt off. So the potatoes like knocking into each other sort of cleans them. So that's sort of what we're doing in community. You know, it's like, yeah, we have brush ups with one another, but through practicing with it and, you know, trying to be our best and to really follow, you know, our vows, we improve over time. And I think that that's what we need to do as a society as well. So I think we can take our, you know, micro society and hopefully expand it outwards, not by proselytizing, but just by, you know, being a good example to other people in the community.
Is there anything else anyone wants to bring up? Thank you so much. This was really a great talk. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
And we'll probably invite you back. And now we end with giving back the merit, and we do it in the style that Thich Nhat Hanh designed, which is call and response. So if I will do the call, and if someone could do the response, we can't all do it because it sounds kind of wonky on. So who's going to do the response for everybody? And you can all do it, just mute yourselves. Thank you, Lorna. May the merit of this practice
May the merit of this practice
benefit all beings
benefit all beings
and bring peace.
and bring peace.
Thank you all. And thank you, Doji-san. Who does anybody know who's giving the talk next week? It's always good to announce it, I guess. But I can't remember. So everyone check the website.
The Reverend Tenzin Seidenberg.
Oh, do you know Tenzin? Doju? He's
I don't think so.
He's a disciple of Taihaku. Taihaku she was not so old, but she suddenly died. And so Tenzin, is that his name? I can't remember his right name, but I met him out in LA in November. He's really a great person, and he has taken this on because he's, I think, her only disciple that has completed his training. So yes, that's something to look forward to. Thank you so much for coming, Doju. This has been so wonderful. And thanks for reconnecting us with Sanshinji. Sanshinji, everyone, is in Bloomington, Indiana. And thank you.
Take care.
Take care, you too.